During World War I, the United States joined the side of the Triple Entente with the UK and France against Germany for several reasons. The way these reasons presented themselves often made it sound like the US siding with the Entente was guaranteed. What many people fail to realize is that the side the US joined the war on was almost a flip of a coin, and that there were many reasons for the US to not join the war at all, or even ally themselves with Germany. So in this video, I'm going to talk about what would have happened if the coin flipped the other way, and the United States sided with Germany in World War I rather than Britain and France. But first, some history. Before the First and Second World War, the subject of Anglo-American relations had always been a very touchy and controversial topic on both sides of the pond. Up until around 1915, it almost seemed like if the US joined any war where the British were involved, they would definitely be on opposing sides. Heck, the US even had a detailed plan for what they were going to do in the event of a war with the British Empire. Once World War I broke out across Europe, the US originally decided to stay neutral in accordance with the majority beliefs of the public and the government, including the US President at the time, Woodrow Wilson. That was until May of 1915, when the British Cunard liner, the RMS Lusitania, was sunk by a German U-boat in the Atlantic bound for Liverpool. This ship happened to also be carrying a lot of American passengers. This event began to fuel some mistrust and distaste for the Germans among the American public. Over time, the US government also began growing concerned about the German army's actions in Belgium. Then in January 1917, the British intercepted a German telegram to Mexico, detailing the Germans' intentions to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, as well as request to Mexico to invade the United States. This was the straw that broke the camel's back, and led to the US declaring war on Germany and joining the Entente on April 6, 1917. The US essentially joined the war as it was coming to a close, and fought against an already dying German empire. Still, it's argued that with the extra aid from the US, the war was shortened by a couple of months to a year, and of course ended in an American victory. The USA took part in the post-war Treaty of Versailles and helped mediate all the humiliating terms made on Germany by the Entente. In the 1920s, leading up to the Depression, the US, as well as the UK and France, also played a role in the downturn of the Weimar German economy, and in World War II, the US joined in yet again against the Germans and aided their defeat and divide in the Cold War. But what if that was different? What if in an alternate universe, instead of joining World War I on the side of the Entente, the US joined in on the side of Germany and their allies? What if the US joined the Central Powers? Working out a point of divergence for this scenario is a little bit more complicated. Rather than a singular event that changes the course of history, there are multiple things that would need to happen or change for the US to join the opposite side. However, mapping out this series of events is not hard. The US already had a significant German population in the Midwest, which was growing every year and taking up a large portion of the American demographics. Obviously, these German Americans would have been in support of their home country, Germany. Extend this support to non-German Americans through a little bit of propaganda by both the German government and the German speakers, and the US is already well on its way to joining Germany. Another thing we'll have to do is prevent the sinking of the Lusitania. In fact, we can go even further by making a British U-boat sink an American ship. We also have to prevent the Zimmermann telegram from not only being intercepted, but not being sent to begin with. Maybe the German government in this alternate universe could realize an opportunity to try and get the US to join their side through a bit of good old propaganda as well. And for the cherry on top, we have to make sure that plans to improve Anglo-American relations after the Civil War never really take off, and the US still remains extremely spiteful of British and French imperialism. This can again be something that the German government can exploit to make the Americans side with them in the First World War. With that all in mind, I think the divergence will explain itself once we get to the actual alternate timeline, so here goes. As always, World War I starts like it normally does, with the assassination of an Austrian archduke in Bosnia and the usual domino effect that leads to all of Europe at war with each other. The US remains hardcore isolationist and refuses to take sides, with many in the government calling it an evil war fought by greedy empires. In December of 1915, a British U-boat accidentally sinks an unarmed American passenger ship carrying people and presents to Europe for Christmas. The news outrages the American public in the US. The German government uses this event to portray the British as evil pirates, and this further increases anti-British sentiment in the US. From 1915 to 1916, the German government launches a series of propaganda campaigns in the US to try and sway American public opinion in their favor, depicting Germany as a force trying to rid Europe of British and French tyranny, and reminding them of the colonial atrocities committed by both of them. In January of 1917, there is a break-in at the British Embassy in the US, in which a few insulting letters are stolen, detailing the British intentions to manipulate the US government to join the side of the Entente and go against Germany. Unsurprisingly, these letters are published. All remaining support for the Entente by the American people plummet. This all leads the US to ally themselves with Germany and declare war on the Entente powers, viewing the British as a threat. The British immediately pull most of their Royal Navy ships out of the North Sea to deal with this new American threat in the Atlantic. This allows Germany to then destroy what's left of the Entente blockade against them. The same thing happens on the Western Front, where many soldiers are redirected to Canada, which is now being invaded by the United States. Thousands of US troops would cross the Canadian border, and Toronto and Ottawa would be taken quickly. The US would also seize British holdings in the Caribbean. Under normal circumstances, the British would stand a chance at defeating the US and kicking them out of Canada. However, the British would have already been fighting a costly war against Germany, and suddenly having to deal with the US, as well as fight a war on two different continents, would have strained their military and supplies far too much. The Battle of the Atlantic would have been extremely costly for the British Royal Navy. Russia, as usual, would have also pulled out by now. By 1918, Canada would be overrun, and the Western Front would have been taken over with the slow removal of British troops. Soon, Paris would be under siege, and the Entente powers would have no choice but to sue for peace, ending the war in a Central Powers plus USA victory. Since the US plays a major part in this alternate Central Powers victory, the peace negotiations would be less focused on taking colonies, but more so liberating and freeing them from colonial oppression. There would be some land grabbing, of course, with the US annexing all of Canada. New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Yukon, and the appropriately renamed Cascadia would all eventually become US states, with the Northwest and Nunavut becoming a US territory. Quebec would kind of become a semi-autonomous territory, kind of like Puerto Rico, and Newfoundland would remain in British hands. Other Caribbean islands like Jamaica would also become US territories. Both Ireland and India would become fully independent, so would Egypt and Libya as somewhat Ottoman puppets. Germany would also receive Nigeria and would annex the Congo, allowing a German Middle Africa colony to eventually be formed. As for France, they'd be forced to give Indochina full independence, as well as hand French Guiana to the Germans. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty would see the independence of many Western Russian states as German clients, while the rest of Russia would become communist-like in our timeline. Encouraged by the US, Austro-Hungary would eventually confederalize and become a union of semi-autonomous ethnic regions, granting it stability for a few more decades. Germany would form its Middle Europa Pact between it and its eastern puppets. The Chinese warlord period would see heavy foreign intervention, and the Japanese Empire would still expand. In the late 1920s, after heavy amounts of reparations, economic downturn, and nationwide humiliation, both France and Britain would experience extreme right nationalist coups and would become fascist dictatorships desperate for revenge. The Spanish Civil War would also conclude by the mid-1930s and see Spain turn fascist as well, leading them to join this new Western European bloc of steel with Britain and France. This would lead to World War II breaking out like in our timeline, except instead of Germany starting it, it would be Britain and France. Britain would invade Ireland and France would invade German colonies in Central Africa. An expanding Japan would also attack the US out of fear and join the fascists. Seeing an opportunity, Britain would invade Quebec and New Brunswick through Newfoundland in an attempt to take back what they called the stolen Canada. This would be met with fierce retaliation by the US, who would push the British out of North America. Fascist France would fail in Africa, and soon the Germans would invade their mainland. France would surrender by 1944, and so would Spain. The US would push Britain out of Ireland and eventually force the UK government to sue for peace, threatening to invade the British mainland. With the fascist defeat, Japan would still be pushed back as normal, and eventually the US would drop the atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Britain and France would have to give up all their colonies as either independent states or German or US puppets and clients. The fascist governments in Britain and France would be toppled. Scotland would become independent, France would join Middle Europa, and the US would become one of, if not the most powerful country in the world. Inevitably, with the end of the World Wars, a Cold War may happen between the US and Germany, but that is where I'm going to end this scenario. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you think the next alternate history scenario should be. See ya!